Jana Yashodanandana Gajajana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajakacarya Ashtotra Sadasri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda Ki. All glories to assembled devotees. All glories to assembled devotees. All glories to assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Parshatya Deshatharine. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudirayet Nashtaprayeshu abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtikhi. Today we are continuing to read from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 26, entitled Fundamental Principles of Material Nature, Text 7. Tadasya samshritir bandha paratantriyam cha tatkritam bhavati akarturishaya sakshino nivritatmanaha. Tadasya samsritir bandha paratantriyam cha tatkritam bhavati akartur ishaya bhavati akartur ishasya sakshino nivritatmanaha. Tadasya samshritir bandha paratantram cha tatkritam bhavati akartur ishasya sakshino nivritatmanaha. Tadasya samsritir bandha paratantram cha tatkritam bhavati akartur ishasya sakshino nivritatmanaha. Tadasya samsritir bandha paratantram cha tatkritam bhavati akartur ishasya sakshino nivritatmanaha. Tadasya Tadasya samsritir bandhaha paratantram chatat kritam bhavatya karturishasya sakshino nivritatmanaha. Word to word meaning, tat, from the misconception, asya, of the conditioned soul, samsritihi, conditioned life, bandhaha, bondage, paratantram, dependence, cha, and tat kritam, made by that, bhavati, is, akartuhu, of the non-doer, ishasya, independent, sakshinaha, the witness, nivritta atmanaha, joyful by nature. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Material consciousness is the cause of one's conditional life, in which conditions are enforced upon the living entity by the material energy. Although the spirit soul does not do anything and is transcendental to such activities, he is thus affected by conditional life. Purport. The Mayavadi philosopher, who does not differentiate between the Supreme Spirit and the individual spirit, says that the conditional existence of the living entity is his leela or pastime. But the word pastime implies employment in the activities of the Lord. The Mayavadis misuse the word and say that even if the living entity has become a stool-eating hog, he is also enjoying his pastimes. This is a most dangerous interpretation. Actually, the Supreme Lord is the leader and maintainer of all living entities. His pastimes are transcendental to any material activity. Such pastimes of the Lord cannot be dragged to the level of the conditional activities of the living entities. In conditional life, the living entity actually remains as if a captive in the hands of material energy. Whatever the material energy dictates, the conditioned soul does. He has no responsibility. He is simply the witness of the action, but he is forced to act in that way due to his offense in his eternal relationship with Krishna. Lord Krishna therefore says in Bhagavad Gita that Maya, his material energy, is so forceful that it is insurmountable. But if a living entity simply understands that his constitutional position is to serve Krishna and he tries to act on this principle, then, however conditioned he may be, the influence of Maya immediately vanishes. This is clearly stated in Bhagavad Gita, 7th chapter. Krishna takes charge of anyone who surrenders to him in helplessness, and thus the influence of Maya or conditional life is removed. The spirit soul is actually Satchitananda, eternal, full of bliss and full of knowledge. Under the clutches of Maya, however, he suffers from continued birth, death, disease, and old age. One has to be serious to cure this condition of material existence and transfer himself to Krishna consciousness, for thus his long suffering may be mitigated without difficulty. In summary, the suffering of the conditioned soul is due to his attachment to material nature. This attachment should thus be transferred from matter to Krishna. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamsya Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostude Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Mother Devahuti expressed her actual position in helplessness and surrendered to Lord Kapila. And she started to lament about how she wasted her valuable time. She did not take the association of Kardama Muni very seriously. Now that he is gone, the Lord himself has appeared in their home. Now she doesn't want to miss the second chance, and then she inquires and she laments. Because she is lamenting to the Lord being merciful bestows this spiritual knowledge. Considering her to be helpless, the affection is drawn. The Lord is very affectionate to his devotees. That affection, based on that affection, the Lord is giving this knowledge. So it is important that even lamentation, when it is done to the right person, and we are in the mood of receiving knowledge, even that lamentation and that proper attitude can connect us to the Lord. So yoga is that connection which connects the jiva to the Supreme Lord. So even through lamentation or vishada, one can connect to the Lord. That's how Bhagavad Gita begins. So here, in the previous chapter, Mother Devahuti asked the Lord to explain about the path of bhakti in detail, and also the knowledge by which the living entity can come out of this entanglement in this material existence, and also about the path of yoga, the Ashtanga Yoga. So, the previous chapter, the details of bhakti were given, and in this chapter, Lord is answering, chapter 26, Lord is answering and explaining the knowledge by which one can come out of the clutches of material existence. So the first two verses of this chapter talk about the benefit of getting this knowledge. So you can be released from the influence of the modes of material nature. Vimuchyate, one can be released. Then it cuts the knot of attachment, hridaya granthi bedanam. It helps one attain self-realization. So this is what you get by acquiring this knowledge. Now why is this presented in the beginning is to make sure that the intelligence and the mind are tuned in to receive the knowledge, to create that interest. What's in it for me? That's the first question that comes up. Okay, I'm going to take up this process. What will I get? What's the goal? What's the result? So if that is told upfront, so then the mind is hooked because of the emotion of being free from this entanglement. The intelligence is hooked by trying to understand the intricate details, this is how material nature is binding me. So, by this combination, there is inspiration to hear, and later on, through this inspiration and by the grace of the Lord, we apply this knowledge and get the results. So this kind of structure is followed even in the introduction to Bhagavad Gita. Prabhupada will list the spirit in which we need to approach Bhagavad Gita, the purpose of Bhagavad Gita, then the actual content, the subject matter, then the result of acquiring this knowledge. So this actually helps a person to focus on the subject that's going to be spoken. So this attracts the mind and the intelligence, and therefore we are more focused. Now the next set of verses, after from verse 3 onwards, the Lord describes about Himself, His glories, how He is no beginning, He is transcendental to the modes of the material nature, He is beyond the existence, He is perceivable everywhere, self-effulgent. This is the Anadir Atma Purusha. So this Purusha who is being explained here is the Supreme Lord. And then later, the modes of material nature is being described as to how it binds, and then the living entity. So, while describing the Lord's interaction with the material energy is described as a pastime. So He chooses when He wants to start the creation, how long He wants to maintain it, when He wants to destroy it. So the time factor is under His control. So it's considered as a past time for Him. Then the role of material nature is given here from verse 5, and then how she binds the living entity. So that is being described in this set of verses 5, 6 and 7, and the effect of such binding. So the original identity of the spirit soul is covered by avidya. Then you take up a false identity because the desire to enjoy and the propensity to lord over is always there. The spiritual identity is covered, so you need to be given a material identity, material form, senses and all of that, and that's what the material nature does. So she does it in a very expert way, and living entity takes up those material bodies and then starts to identify with that. And forgetfulness was described yesterday. So the word field of activities was used in yesterday's verse. It's very significant, and that's how the 13th chapter, which we will discuss in detail, 3 or 4 verses, which talks about the theme of the field of activities, then the role of the Ishvara, Jiva and Prakriti. So today's verse talks about the material consciousness contrasted with spiritual consciousness. The material conditioned life versus the actual identity, the free spiritual existence. So these two are being shown side by side so that we can understand and appreciate. And also the theme of Leela is being brought out in today's purport. And Prabhupada first begins by refuting how the activities of living entity in this material world are misinterpreted by Mayavadi philosophers to be a pastime or a Leela. So in this, while lecturing on this particular verse, Prabhupada makes the point that Mayavadis do not accept distinction between soul and the super soul. because devotees discuss that the Lord is having pastimes. As a young boy, stealing butter, killing demons, and all of this. So they equate the living being also at the same level as that of the Lord, and even if the living entity is suffering, they describe that also as a pastime. And that's why a very graphic example is given, a stool-eating hog. Prabhupada says in that lecture, even if you give halwa to the hog will not like the halwa. It will reject the halwa and go and eat the stool, because that's how he is conditioned. So he is bringing out the point, even though the living entity is suffering, we cannot call that as Leela, and it is offensive. Why? Because you're bringing down the Lord, who is independent, who is beyond the material modes, to the level of a living being, and saying that, equating our activities, our sufferings, to that of the Lord's enjoyment. Because he is never in touch with the material nature. He does that through time. So first, having refuted that, this mentality of bringing down the Lord and equating him to be same as the soul, that's an offense. And it is because of this offense that one loses his connection with the Supreme Lord. And that's the root cause why we are here. The internal mood of Prabhupada and being so heavy is that a living entity, after a very long time, takes up the spiritual path. Even in the spiritual path, if one is misled, again to go back and commit offenses and fall down from that exalted position, that's not a very ideal position. And that's why, because of his compassion, that urge to save the living entities from the clutches of this material energy, that's why this heaviness comes out. A lot of times this is questioned, why this heavy attitude towards impersonalism? Because after many lifetimes one comes up to spiritual path, again if they are misled, that's not going to help them. So of that compassion, of that sense of urgency, it's there in every purport actually. If you see the last paragraph, one has to be serious to cure this condition of material existence and transfer himself to Krishna consciousness. And then Prabhupada says, in summary, the suffering of the conditioned soul is due to his attachment to material nature. So, this sense of urgency we can see in Prabhupada's purports, and that's the reason why he is hammering the impersonal philosophy. So having understood that, why we should not equate the Lord's activity to that of the living entity's activities, and how it is a most dangerous interpretation, we will now look at the theme of the Lord, the living entity, and the material nature. How the material nature binds the living entity. So we are going to look at the verses from the 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So before that, I want to touch upon this verse from the 3rd chapter where it clearly says, Prakrite kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashaha ahankara vimudatma kartaham iti manyate. Anyone knows the translation? You can look it up, 327. Yeah, the spirit soul bewildered by, very good, false ego, thinks that he is a doer, whereas in actuality it's done by 3 modes of material nature. So, here we will see as to what is happening, and the analysis is based on cause and effect, and that's how the 13th chapter will begin, as to explaining these 3 subject matters, Ishvara, Jiva and Prakriti, in terms of cause and effect analysis. So why do we have to get into this cause and effect analysis? And that's what Lord Kapila is also going to do here. This cause and effect analysis, it describes what is happening, what is actually happening behind the scenes, how the modes are binding you. It also describes who is involved, Ishvara, Jiva and Prakriti. And what is the role? It also gives in detail about the role of individuals. What is Prakriti's role, what is Jiva's role, and what is Ishvara's role. It also analyzes, so cause and effect analysis also analyzes why things are happening. So it describes what is happening, who is involved, why this is happening. So, if we want to get into that theme in chapter 13, it begins pretty much from verse 20, where it talks about material nature, the living entity and the Supreme Lord. It goes up to 24, 25, like that. So, we will start to look at verse 21 from chapter 13. It's a little technical, but however, it is good to understand so that we can get out of this entanglement. And that's one of the benefits of understanding this knowledge. So, Karya Karana Kartrutve Hetuhu Prakritir Uchate Purushaha Sukha Dukkhanam Bhoktrutve Hetur Uchate. So this is 13:21. Nature is said to be the cause of all material cause and effect, as I described. There is a cause and there is an effect. So, cause in itself is very subtle. It comes in the form of a desire, whereas effect is when you put it into action and visible action is done and there's an effect is produced. So, for example, if I'm thirsty, the desire to drink water is there. So that's subtle, is quenching of the thirst. So, these elements, they're all given by the material nature. Whereas, what's the living entity? The living entity is the cause of various sufferings and enjoyments in this world. So, here it clearly tells who is responsible for what. The living entity is the cause of various suffering and enjoyment. So, I drink cold water, the outside temperature is warm, I drink cold water, it's going to cause enjoyment to me, at least I think like that. Now, if the outside temperature is really cold, and if I'm drinking cold water, I may suffer. So, the reason for suffering is the responsibility is with the living entity. So the living entity is the cause of various suffering and enjoyment in this world. So through this example, the field of activity is this material world, because the living entity is now ignorant of his spiritual identity. He identifies himself with this material world. So he's given a new identity and he starts to act in that way. So here we cannot blame the material nature because you are giving me suffering. So the living entity is clearly said is the cause of various suffering and enjoyment in this world. So, having clarified that, we will go a little deeper into the role of material nature. What is the role of material nature in this triangle of Ishvara, Jiva and Prakriti? So, the living entity is made forgetful of his spiritual identity. Now, to understand this, let's go take a real life example. If I am going to visit somebody who is really sick in an ICU in a hospital, so I'm entering the hospital, then they will ask me if I'm going to enter some specific rooms. They'll give me a special dress, probably ask me even to wear a mask, and they'll give me a label saying, you're a visitor, you're visiting so-and-so room, and the tag will be stuck on you. And you'll be given various... So what's happening here is your actual identity is taken away and you can't remain without an identity. So you're given a false identity. You're a visitor, you're so-and-so, you're coming to this particular place, and this is your start time, this is your end time. And within the hospital, you can go into only these particular areas. And you have to visit that particular person and then come out. Now, within the hospital, if you're feeling thirsty, if you're feeling hungry, you have to use the facilities only within that particular place. So your actual identity is covered, you're given a false identity, and you start identifying with that environment and act as if you are going to be in that hospital for a longer period. So this is what is happening. The avidya covers the spiritual identity, gives you a material identity, and here is where the living entity, based on his previous desires, he is given various choices. Material nature makes us do what is called shopping based on your desires. What you deserve, she gives. It's like body shopping. Okay, I have this set of desires, so then I get a particular type of ears, eyes, nose, body, everything. Why am I in a male or a female body? It's because I had a particular type of desire to enjoy. The material nature gives a body of a hog or a dog or a demigod or so on. And she packages this material body in such a way that it looks attractive and puts the living entity inside that bag. This body can be called as a bag or a machine. And that's what Prabhupada writes in that the sum total, body and instrument, senses, is offered by material nature. That's her role. So this is us stuck inside the body, living spirit soul, with the gross and subtle body. Gross means this earth, water, fire, air, ether, the elements that you can see. The subtle coverings are your mind, intelligence, and false ego. Now, the outside environment around us, there also again you'll see the same elements, earth, water, fire, air, ether, in various transformed forms. So the building is now in a solid form. So prior to that, it was in the form of cement, sand, mixed with water and made into a particular structure, and now it is standing as a solid structure. So the environment around us, so I'm sitting on earth, it's giving me support, that's also material nature. However, this field of activity is not permanent. By design, it is temporary and full of misery. That's how Krishna describes it, dukkhalayam ashashvatam. That's how material nature is designed. So this doesn't match with the original nature of the living entity, who is, as Prabhupada says here, Satchitananda, eternal, full of bliss and full of knowledge. So this is why there is a mismatch. We look for a place where there is no misery, which is permanent, where there is no changes, but we are in a world which is constantly changing. So this is the role of material nature, as we saw. Gives the bodies and creates the environment around you, and then various ways by which you can enjoy, because earth has got fragrance, fire has got form, water has got taste. Like that, every element has got a particular enticing attribute which attracts you and you want to enjoy. Now, what's the role of jiva in this combination of Prakriti, Jiva and Ishvara? So Prabhupada writes, according to one's desires and activities. This is what you can do. Desire is the subtle cause and activity is the effect, the gross effect. Desire and act. So according to the Jiva's desires and activities, material nature places one in various residential quarters. That's how Prabhupada writes it in the 13th chapter. So what can the jiva do? It can desire and I want to act on those desires. So as soon as I want to act, because I don't have my spiritual senses active at this point, I need to use the material senses which are given by the material nature. As soon as I start using the facilities given by the material nature, I come under the control of material nature. Just as we saw the example of a person entering the hospital, if you're outside the hospital, the rules of hospital doesn't govern you. But as soon as you go in as a visitor, you want to meet a particular person, they're given a false identity, all the rules apply. And within the hospital, you try to look for enjoyment. You may not like to enjoy within a hospital, then you want to come out. So, to execute the desires of the living entity. So the living entity can desire and can act on that. So we need knowledge acquiring senses and working senses. This is given by the material nature. And as soon as we start using the facilities of material nature, we come under her control. And that's what's being described here in the purport. Conditional life in which conditions are enforced upon the living entity by the material energy. So Prabhupada says, it might be more clear to state that this body is the effect of the senses. The senses are instruments for gratifying desire. So the reason why we get the body is we have a desire and we act, and then we get a body. There's one more factor involved. Who is the third person? Who is the third person here? We discussed Jiva, we have discussed Prakriti. Who is the third one? Ishvara. Good. Ishvara is the controller. If you see them as a triangle, so if you can picture Ishvara on top, and below him is the Prakriti and the Jiva. So both are under the control of Ishvara. So the Ishvara, in the form of Super Soul, he accompanies the living entity in every life, and then based on his sanction, you get a particular type of body. So the Jiva desires and wants to act, then Ishvara as Super Soul, he sanctions, then the material nature gives you a particular kind of body. So your desire, Jiva's desire plus karma plus the sanction of the Super Soul. Three things are involved so that you get a body. So this gives a clarity of whose role, who's doing what. So the material nature gives the facilities, the Jiva desires and wants to act, then the Lord sanctions. So the material nature, which is, if you see the triangle, Prakriti is here and Jiva is here. So if the living entity, because he is a marginal potency, if he identifies himself as a spirit soul, then Prakriti's influence will start reducing on him. Because you're identifying as a spiritual being, then the effect of time does not affect, the effect of modes does not have effect, the deteriorating influence on you. Because the Jiva is bound by the material nature through the modes, and Ishvara is spiritual in nature. If you identify with the spiritual nature, then the influence of the modes will not affect you. You gradually come out of the influence of the modes. So that's why if we are reading the nature of soul in the second chapter, the soul is eternal, ajo nitya shashvatoyam purano na hanyate hanyamane sharire. Can never be killed nor burnt by fire, wind, water, all these elements. Radhika Prasad Prabhu put it in a nice way that these demigods who are in charge of the various fire, water elements, they can't affect the soul. They have no influence, so we don't have to fear them. And this knowledge gives fearlessness so that we can turn towards the Lord without having the fear of these demigods they may cause difficulties to me, because the Lord is controller of the demigods and the soul by nature can't be influenced by any of these elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. So, we talked about the influence of the three modes, and to come out of the influence of time, again, it's through the time factor that the Ishvara, Lord, controls both the material nature, because material nature has got a creation, maintenance and destruction. Now, can the jiva, does it have the spirit soul, does it have creation, maintenance, destruction? What do you think? Jiva, spirit soul, does it have creation, maintenance and destruction? Based on what you learned in chapter 2. Yes, Ian.
Yes, it has.
Huh?
Because it's born, it lives and it dies. The jiva.
Jiva, okay. What do you think, Sanjeev? Does the spirit soul, does it go through creation, maintenance and destruction?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. Yeah. So because the qualities of the soul, it says indestructible, insoluble. So what's going through those transformation is the material nature. So the body takes birth, body stays for a while and body dies. So if we identify ourselves with the spirits, with our actual nature, then the effect of time decreases. You get the point? The more you identify at the spiritual level, the effect of time also diminishes, because you are always, you're existing. Nitya, Satchit Ananda. So the Sat part is emphasized in those when Lord Krishna is describing the characteristics of the soul in the second chapter. So the more you identify with the spiritual side, the effect of time is gone, the effect of the modes are also gone. So this is how that the jiva has to connect himself to the Supreme Lord. And what's the word that we use? It's very famous. What is the word that we use to connect the jiva to Ishvara? Yoga. Very good. You got it. So yoga is the word that's how jiva connects back to Ishvara through his various propensities. So this yoga, when it is predominantly based on actions of the body, what do you call that yoga as? Actions of the body. So what's the Sanskrit term for action? Karma. Very good. That's right. So if the connection is predominantly based on actions of the body, it's called karma yoga. If the connection is predominantly based on intellectual understanding, speculation and all that, it's jnana. This is what we're dealing with today. And if the connection is predominantly based, and if it's purely, so there is predominantly based on devotion, and there is pure devotion as well. So there is mixed bhakti and pure bhakti. So you're surrendering your body, mind, and your intelligence and all of that. Out of all of this, bhakti yoga helps us to surrender our body, mind, words, intelligence, and reinstates us in our actual identity. And that's why it is the topmost. So the jiva connecting to Ishvara is done through yoga, and that yoga are of different types: karma, jnana, ashtanga, and then bhakti. So in bhakti, we give up our false identity, false ego, and we are reinstated in our actual identity. So the point of attachment is being brought out. Attachment to material existence is the key factor that's keeping us. But the same attachment, when it is directed towards Krishna, it liberates us. And Lord Kapila also talked about this in the previous chapter, how attachment to material nature is a cause of bondage, and when that same attachment is directed towards the sadhus, prasangam ajaram pasham. Yeah, that's how the verse will begin. So in that verse, pasham is you're bound. When the attachment is towards material nature, you're bound, whereas the same attachment is directed towards the sadhus. That's how you come out of the material existence. Because you hear from them, then your intelligence is awakened. Intelligence is now guided by spiritual wisdom. Then you start acting on those wisdom by applying your mind, your knowledge acquiring senses and the working senses. They're all being directed by the spiritual wisdom, and they're becoming purified. And that's why even in that section, 13th chapter, Prabhupada will urge that we must take up this process. So Prabhupada not only describes the solution, describes the problem in great detail, like this is how you're being bound, this is the role of jiva, this is the role of prakriti, but he also gives a solution. So here are his words. One has to rise, therefore, above the three material modes and become situated in the transcendental position. That is called Krishna consciousness. So we are situated at the moment in conditioned life in Prakriti. Prakriti sthani. Sthana, your sthana is on Prakriti. But now we have to rise and go above the modes and be situated in Suddha Sattva. Krishna will use this word, yogastha kuru karmani. Be situated in yoga and then attain that supreme destiny. Yogastha kuru karmani, sangam tyaktva dhananjaya. Give up this sangha of the three modes and be situated in yoga, such equanimity. So don't be affected by siddhya siddhyo, samo bhutva, by success and failure. Why is he saying that? Is because the moment you have desire and hatred, that's where the material nature, the deluding potency of the Lord takes birth. That's how the Lord describes it. And in the purport of 7th chapter, Ichcha Dvesha Samutvena, in that particular purport, Prabhupada will say that desire and hatred, they affect the consciousness of the living entity, and when the consciousness is affected, you become polluted and you fall down. So in this, continuing back in this 13th chapter purport, Prabhupada is urging us to take up this solution, be situated in a transcendental position, and he says, this can be affected only by hearing from authoritative sources. So thereby you can situate in Daivi Prakriti. Mahatmanastu mam partha Daivim Prakriti Ashrita. So from material consciousness, being situated in Prakriti to divine consciousness. And that is affected through hearing. So you hear and then you lose your desire to lord over material nature, and then you experience spiritual bliss. So Prabhupada lists the steps you go through when you take up this process. You submit to the hearing process, you lose your desire to dominate the material nature, and you're enjoying spiritual bliss. So these three happen. And this is described in the first canto, second chapter, Divinity and Divine Service. The steps are described. Shinvatam Swakata Krishna. If you read through that section, it describes. There also you will see Vidyate Hridaya Granthis Chidyante Sarva Samshaya. The hard knot is cut. So thus we covered the role of material nature, the role of jiva, the role of Ishvara, how the living entity forgets his spiritual identity, he is given an identity, false identity, then he starts to enjoy, identify himself. The more he identifies with the material nature, with the body, he is bound. The more he identifies with the spiritual nature, he is coming out of the influence of time and the three modes. So I'll conclude with this point where Durvasa Muni, when he was questioned about how the Lord is the topmost brahmachari, how is Lord Krishna the topmost brahmachari, and how Durvasa Muni, after having eaten all the nice relishable items which the gopis bring him, he will still claim that I am fasting. So when he's trying to explain this concept, he will explain it by saying this five elements. This earth has got fragrance. The spirit soul is separate from the earth and its fragrance. Although the spirit soul is situated on the earth element, the earth and the fragrance does not affect the soul. And even though the influence is felt at the level of senses, the soul is not affected. And he will step by step explain, and therefore he will say, I am not the enjoyer, the soul is not the enjoyer. So therefore I did not eat, relish all of this. But his hidden intention was that my desire is not just to eat the relishables that you got, the exalted devotees of the Lord, you gopis, but to take your association. That is more relishable for me than eating the dishes that you bought me. Because he understands the exalted position of the gopis. And then with the same logic, he'll establish how the Lord, he does not desire to enjoy the gopis, but he still has that loving dealings with them. He's serving them. So in that sense, he's not enjoying at a material level. So that's how he will conclude. But the philosophical point he makes in that section was pretty strong, so it just struck me. So I just thought of sharing. I'll conclude here and see if there are any comments or questions. Yes, Ian.
You said earlier that there was two types of bhakti, bhakti and pure bhakti.
Yes, so we saw that bhakti mixed with two types of bhakti. Mixed bhakti is mixed with the modes, mixed with goodness, passion and ignorance. Pure devotion is where you don't have any other desires other than to please the Lord, and there is a full definition for that. So okay, if there are no more questions, we'll conclude here. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.